is one question that is coming. So while we're waiting for others, maybe you could sort of start, just answering the question.
Yeah.
So the question that has come is, if you have somebody with MI and stroke, what is the preferred agent and what dose should you really start on?
This is for simultaneous occurrence of MI and stroke. It's very, very rare. Very rare. I've not seen such a case which comes together. But if it comes, on the rare occasion that it comes, the treatment would be first to give stroke dose of Actylase, followed by PAMI.
Followed by PAMI.
Yes.
But then would PAMI be risky because it will be a sort of you'll have an anticoagulation effect all over.
There's
the
no
chance
problem.
of bleeding may become, right?
Because the dose of the half-life of Actylase is only a few minutes.
And then you need to heparinize the patient post.
You can see, the thing is that you have to delay antiplatelets by 24 hours. That was the original recommendation. But there is no study to show that delaying the heparin or delaying the antiplatelets or giving them early is detrimental. So this is a very rare occurrence to occur, very rare thing to occur. But you'll have to take that chance in these cases. So,
but it won't increase the risk of bleeding if you heparinize?
It may increase the risk of bleeding to some extent, but that's the way to do it, because otherwise, you have to save the heart. If the heart, there's a big infarction, he may die. Also, the stroke is highly disabling. So, but if it is a large vessel occlusion, perhaps you can do thrombectomy straight without giving Actylase, and then go in for a PAMI. So it depends. If it is a large vessel occlusion, then go in for a thrombectomy followed by a PAMI. So it depends on case to case. But you see, it's very rare to see this.
But suppose you don't have any facility for PAMI, then what do you do?
Then you give IV TPA.
What चालू हो रहा है वहाँ पे? क्या? Patient है वहाँ पे.
अरे एक तो आता है फिर दूसरा जो होता है.
Can you please mute your mic, please? Can you mute your mic? Please mute your mic.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. There is another question. Is there any preferred drug?
I can't see it.
Duration? Sir,
we can see you, sir. We can see you. Hi.
We can see you, sir. Okay, Nestle. There is another question that is there any preferred drug according to duration of onset of stroke?
No.
What do you see?
No.
At least
there is no preferred drug according to duration of stroke.
No.
Okay. Now, suppose patient comes out of the time window for thrombolysis. What would be your immediate steps for the patient?
Then, we don't know the time of onset, or the time of onset is delayed. So you'll have to do multimodality studies like MRI, MR perfusion, or CT perfusion. And if you find a mismatch, then you can take up, and the infarct pore is small and the penumbra is big, then you can take these patients up for IV TPA. Or recently there was a trial called Extend. What is the name of the trial? Extend IA trial, where you can give IV thrombolysis for up to 9 hours, but you have to do detailed imaging, and you have to find a mismatch. You have to find the penumbra, which is large. If you do that multimodality imaging and you find that there is a big mismatch, then you can give IV TPA up to 9 hours. Or if it is a large vessel occlusion, you can do it up to 24 hours. Up to 24 hours. Now see, this is a very important new trial, which is called the DAWN trial. and it has changed our concepts. You know, initially we were always saying that time is brain, but now we are saying that time is brain. Of course it is brain, but tissue is also brain. So if you have salvageable tissue, then you can go up to 24 hours to do thrombectomy.
Provided there is a mismatch.
Yes, yes. So you have to do very detailed. You can't just do a normal CT or a normal MRI. You have to do multimodality. This thing. You have to do a perfusion scan. That means you have to give a dye and you have to see, or you have to give a dye even in MRI. And if you find a small core and a large penumbra, then you can do these patients.
Anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask before we start today's session. There was some questions that were raised yesterday. We couldn't address it. If you want to ask any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can type out, I can read out for you. So quickly, let's address yesterday's questions before we move on today.
Sir, actually, I wanted to ask, why do we thrombolize a venous stroke?
Why don't we
thrombolize a venous stroke, sir? If
venous stroke.
Yes, sir. If a venous sinus thrombosis causes an ischemic stroke, then why isn't that patient eligible for a thrombolysis?
No, you know, in venous strokes, often it is a very large hemorrhagic infarct. So the hemorrhage component is very large. But having said that, so IV thrombolysis is not possible. But you know, in very serious cases who are not responding to heparin or oral anticoagulants, you can do intrasinus thrombectomy and thrombolysis. So this is still not in the recommendations. It is just good clinical practice. And in a minority of cases only you will require that. So you can do intrasinus thrombolysis. You have to put in a catheter into the interjugular vein and then into the into the sigmoid sinus and transverse sinus, and then go up to the clot and evacuate the clot mechanically and put in a thrombolytic agent. But what? IV thrombolysis we don't do.
Nasli, if you remember, we had one case when you were there.
The screen.
Just taking you for a ride. 35 finally, it doesn't require any treatment. Nothing is required.
Yeah, say that again.
Sir, you wanted to ask something. Sir, you wanted to say something. Sir, you want to say something.
I think he's disconnected, Sanjay.
No, he's there. I can see him there. I've unmuted him also because I think he muted himself.
Okay, okay.
Okay, doesn't matter.
Okay. Gayatri, one thing I wanted to, you know, we were discussing, I thought I should bring that point up. You were discussing that embolic stroke and thrombotic stroke and hemorrhagic stroke and all that. In every stroke patient, you have to answer one very important question. What is the mechanism of stroke? Because is it a small vessel lesion? Is it a large vessel lesion? Is it a cardioembolic lesion? Is it a artery-to-artery embolus? Is it a thrombus in the artery? Is it a vasculitis? Because the treatment will differ and this thing will differ. So is it a PFO? That means patent foramen ovale. Is it that? So we need to answer these questions. So in every case, you must write on the case paper and make all effort to diagnose mechanism of stroke, which is called MOS. So every time you may not be able to say what is the MOS. You know, you may need investigations or you can't make the diagnosis of MOS, then you call it cryptogenic stroke.
Okay, any questions for Dr. Ichapuria before we start? Anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. This is a teaching session, so don't feel shy. Just unmute and ask questions. Okay, Gayatri, start today's session.
Yes, sir. So I believe we were at the IV alteplase eligibility. So we can so administration of IV alteplase is in eligible patients without first obtaining an MRI is recommended. So here actually I was finding this a bit funny because they are saying that we can push alteplase just with the clinical.
No. So, these cerebral microbleeds, this is now a new, not new, it's about 10, 12 years old. After we've started doing MRIs, we find these small black dots in the MRI. Now, these small black dots are what we call microhemorrhages. So there are two important reasons for these cerebral microbleeds. When they are in the basal ganglia, they are related to hypertension. But when they are in the cortex, they are related to amyloid angiopathy. And amyloid angiopathy, they can get intracerebral hemorrhage because the vessels, it's a vasculopathy because of deposition of amyloid in the vessels. So these microbleeds can bleed. So if you have more than 10 microbleeds, then you have to be very careful with IV thrombolysis. But you need not do an MRI to find out. If you have an old MRI which shows more than 10 microbleeds, then you may use a lower dose of IV TPA. Though this is not written in stone, this is not absolute, but you have to be cautious because the chance of bleeding is more. If you have 5 to 10 microbleeds, then you can safely give it. It's the thing is, but don't do an MRI to see the microbleeds. If you have an old MRI, you see it in that, and if there are more than 10, be little careful.
What would the typical appearance of the microbleed be?
It's a small black dot which is seen in T2 star image, that is susceptibly SWI. SWI image you should see for seeing hemorrhage, or it's also called T2 star, and you see those small black dots. So if you see those, and in old people, you will see many old people will have this. But if it is in the basal ganglia and in the thalamus, it is related to hypertension. And if it is in the cortex or in the subcortical areas, it is related to amyloid angiopathy.
So this entity of multi-infarct dementia, which we used to diagnose, is it still valid? Because this combo amyloid thing was.
No, that time we didn't know this amyloid. Even in the first generation MRIs, we couldn't do this SWI. This thing. So that we've started doing in the last 10 years or so. And we found this, this is amyloid deposition in the vessels. Many of these patients are old and many of these patients have dementia.
So as mentioned yesterday, the patients eligible for IV alteplase benefit because of therapy. And we shouldn't wait for MRI, we should definitely do a CT. And as mentioned yesterday, if it is a wake-up stroke, then we should see the diffusion positive flare negative lesions.
We discussed that.
So coming to mechanical thrombectomy. So sir, I'll speak about mechanical thrombectomy a bit in detail, I think in the coming slides. So other diagnostic tests, obviously blood sugar is the only test that is more important than any other investigation in a stroke case. Baseline echocardiography, baseline troponin tests should not delay the alteplase therapy for the patient or the mechanical thrombectomy. And useful use of chest X-ray is unclear, as we can see. So I think we've discussed all this yesterday. So here, the eligibility for emergency reperfusion therapy. So we had mentioned about this yesterday as well. If the BP is high, how do we get it down so that we can thrombolyze the patient? But yeah, as mentioned here, if BP is not, it's not coming down, and if it is still above 185 by 100, more than or equal to, then autoclave is not recommended. BP monitoring to be done every 15 minutes to 2 hours from the start of autoclave therapy.
For 2 hours.
For every 30 minutes, for 6 hours, then hourly for the next 16 to 24 hours. Similarly, Labit, Nicardia, and Selvidipine are used for further prophylaxis of this fresh stroke patient.
We'll take this out and do it.
Yeah. Now see that. Okay. Continue.
Shall I go up?
Yeah.
Okay. So we had also discussed about the dosage of alteplase, which is 0.9 mg per kg, maximum going up to 90 milligrams over 60 minutes. 10% as a bolus and 90% as an infusion. So obviously we had reviewed about the inclusion and exclusion criteria as well. So for mild strokes, so for patients with mild but disabling strokes, IV autoclave is recommended for patients who can be treated within 3 hours of ischemic stroke symptoms, or patient which was last known well or at baseline stage. For otherwise eligible patients with mild disabling stroke, IV autoclave may be reasonable for patients can be treated within 3 to 4.5 hours of the ischemic stroke from the patient's last known well. This is level 2, level B of level of evidence.
2B, yeah.
Yes, 2B. So, sir, actually, here they are mentioning that if it is a mild disabling stroke,
mild non-disabling stroke and mild disabling stroke. So, what is the difference between the two?
Sir, mild non-disabling, I believe, would be an NIHS of less than 3.
So, even mild disabling is also NIHS of 0 to 5. So how do you distinguish this?
Sir, actually, I believe that personally that the NIHS scoring does not include a lot of symptoms that a fresh stroke patient comes with. They have mentioned in the NIHS that there is sensory symptoms, sensory like paresthesia as the patient gets. There is a scoring for that, but it doesn't really mention what kind of paresthesia.
Now, see, this NIHSS, no, as you said, it doesn't capture everything.
Yeah, right.
Now, suppose you have a patient with aphasia, global aphasia. So that NIHS is only 2, but it's highly disabling. Or if you have hemianopia, it's devastating. You can't work. You can't drive. You can't do so many things. You keep banging into objects, but still the NIHS is only 2. Or if you have a hand which is weak or which is a useless hand syndrome, the NIHS is only 2, but still you can't use that hand. So this is disabling. So even though the NIHS is low, if it is a disabling stroke, so that is what is meant by mild disabling stroke and mild non-disabling strokes. So which is a mild non-disabling stroke? So, little sensory numbness, little dysarthria, slight facial weakness, slight gaze palsy. This would be classified as mild non-disabling stroke. So, the fellow comes with only mild facial weakness. Yeah, you won't give TPA for such a patient, if his speech is normal, or if he has mild dysarthria but no aphasia. So you may think that, okay, let's not give it in, it's too mild, and the risk may outweigh the benefit. So therefore it is 3. But if it is severe aphasia, hemianopia, useless hand syndrome, even though the NIHS is low, it is highly disabling. So in these patients, you give it and the level of evidence is 2B. That means benefit is equal to is greater than or equal to risk.
There are certain specific diseases such as sickle cell anemia in which IV autoclave is recommended.
Let's not go through. These are rare occurrences. Sickle cell we rarely see. as I told you, in a young child, if you see sickle cell, then maybe you can give, we discussed that yesterday. Hyperdense MCA sign, okay.
Right. So in patients of hyperdense MCA, IV alteplase can be beneficial.
Beneficial.
Right.
Yeah.
So moving ahead, the bleeding risk. Given the extremely low risk of unsuspected abnormal platelet counts or coagulation studies in the population, it is reasonable that urgent IV alteplase treatment should not be delayed while waiting for the hematological or coagulation tests, level 2B.
Yeah. So we discussed that. So you send the blood, but don't wait for the report, but definitely take the history. Not recently, about 2 years back, one of our residents, very good resident we had, but she missed the history that patient had taken chemotherapy. It was a big costly mistake. And afterwards, the platelet count came to 25,000. But she had already given alteplase. And patients with malignancy are very prone to getting stroke. And so she missed that history. She gave alteplase, and then the report came that 25. But luckily, and God is great, nothing happened to the patient. So take a history properly of malignancy, dengue, liver failure, kidney failure before you give this thing.
Dr. Nasli, in gastroenterology, we have a lot of thrombosis because of non-vascular causes like portal vein thrombosis, hypercoagulable state.
Yeah.
So are there any causes of stroke which are non-vascular? So we talk about atherothrombosis, arterial emboli, artery to artery, and so on.
Yeah.
So are there things like...
Now Dr. Wadia has been a pioneer in this. We found this vitamin deficiency and hyperhomocystinemia. That produces arterial and venous strokes. So that is by far the commonest cause of coagulopathy that we see in our setting. But another important cause of coagulopathy is malignancy. And if you have lesions in 3 vascular territories, 3 unrelated vascular territories, you must think of an abdominal malignancy. And the test to do is do a D-dimer test. And the D-dimer, if it is high, then you suspect malignancy and you look for a malignancy. So this is a very other important cause of coagulopathy. And then, rarer cause of coagulopathy are this lupus anticoagulant. That means APLA syndrome. Now, APLA can also produce arterial as well as venous strokes. So both type of strokes can occur. So you look for APLA. I wouldn't say it's common. It's not common. It's rare. But in a young stroke, you look for that. But to send the blood for this protein S and protein C and whatever that factor 5 laden is not recommended. It's not recommended because the chance of finding it is extremely low. It is less than 1%. And, you get some vague values of protein C deficiency and protein S deficiency, and really you don't know how to handle it. So if Samir is here, maybe he can tell us something more. But as a general rule, it is not recommended to send the coagulation profile. But in our setting, I think we must, in every single case, do B12, homocysteine, and also look for malignancy. So in the coagulopathies, I think these are important. Dr. Wadia, you want to say something? Yeah. 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 You have muted your mic.
I've unmuted it from my end.
Yes, now speak up. Sir, speak up. Sir, speak up.
If you think of homocysteine,
yeah,
it is so common that really there's no point in doing the homocysteine level.
Yeah.
You can straight away give B12 in association with all the others.
B12. Just give B12.
Was 75%.
Yeah.
Homocysteine may take time to come.
Exactly. So just give it. You see, just give it. What's the point in doing it? I mean, according to me, whole of India is deficient in B12 and vitamin D. And vitamin D, B12, iron, zinc. The whole of India is deficient in micronutrients. Even though you look well nourished, you are deficient in micronutrients. So just give it. It's cheap. It's effective. Why waste time here and there? You know, to do the test costs thousands of rupees, and to give the injection or the tablet is a few, not even 100 rupees. It's even less. So just do it. Yeah.
So as you were mentioning, for patients of acute MI, treatment with IV autoclaves at the dose appropriate for cerebral ischemia is followed by the PCA and stenting if required, level 2A.
Yeah, Sanjay, you were asking this point, no?
Sanjay? That's right. I was asking this.
So here it is. It is level 2A. Where is it? Acute MI.
Yes,
read that again, Gayatri.
For patients presenting with concurrent acute ischemic stroke and acute MI, treatment with IV alteplase at the dose of appropriate for cerebral ischemia is done, followed by percutaneous coronary angioplasty and stenting if indicated. Is reasonable. 2A. Level
2A. Sanjay.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
And recent MI for patients with acute ischemic stroke and a history of recent MI, that is in the past 3 months, treating the stroke with IV alteplase is reasonable if the recent MI was a non-stem. But I think it is not indicated if it was a.
No, but now see what the problem is with MI now. With the explosion of interventional cardiology, many of these patients have been stented early, or thrombolysis has been given early. So the myocardial scar is very small. So if the myocardial scar is big and in the anterior myocardium, then maybe in the early stage you would not give it. Why would you not give it? Because very few cases have occurred in the literature, maybe 5 or 10, of cardiac rupture after giving IV thrombolysis. But if the infarct has been in the inferior wall or posterior wall or the right ventricle, you can give IV thrombolysis. There's no problem, and especially if acute angioplasty has been done and the myocardium is saved, then you can give IV TPA without any hesitation and without much risk.
Dr. Makle is with us. Maybe he can give some comments.
Yeah, Makle.
Makle, you want to say?
Hello.
Yeah,
we can hear you.
Yeah. So, actually, the role of the primary angioplasty, honestly, I would like to differ with you. The primary angioplasty done as early as possible and shorter the door to the balloon, or rather than door to the balloon, it is the indexed onset of the pain to the stenting. The shorter the myocardial salvage is better.
Yes. So therefore the scar is not very big, so you can give IV TPA. That is exactly what I said.
I don't agree. Because the right coronary artery, if it is a super dominant, it will definitely supply the posterior papillary muscle, and the sequelae of papillary muscle dysfunction or papillary muscle rupture are high. And of course, these patients then can go into the mitral regurgitation or left ventricular failure. So it is the salvage of the myocardium which is important.
Yes.
As early as possible.
Yes. So if the myocardium is salvaged, then and the myocardium is safe, then you can certainly give this even in the first 6 to 7 weeks. And the myocardium takes about 6 to 7 weeks to heal. After that, though, you can safely give. After 6 to 7 weeks, you can safely give. But in the first 6 weeks also you can give if these conditions are met and primary angioplasty has been done and the myocardium is saved. So you can give it even early.
Particularly in our Indian subset, we are getting the younger and younger patients.
Yeah. We are getting young strokes, young myocardial at 25, 23, 25.
will not believe, like 18-year-old, 20-year-old, and most of them are actually thrombotic.
See, myocardium is always thrombosis. No, myocardium, there is no other mechanism.
No, most of them are either a smoker or hyperhomocystinemia or some genetics.
Or smoker.
Many times they are fully thrombus overloaded. You know,
yes.
You have to really keep on sucking the thrombus out, and at times you can just do it with the even plain balloon also, and they do improve well. So treating the patient who is in the early 30s and treating the patient who is in 40s or 50s is a different ball game. You know, the same patient or the same territories, I will treat it as a different way. Like, for example, a patient with a young, I'll try to go as early as possible. Okay, please go ahead, because I joined late.
Yeah.
So similarly, conditions where there is a left atrial, left ventricular thrombus, the acute ischemic stroke, for patients with major acute ischemic stroke likely to produce severe disability, and with known thrombus, LA or LV thrombus, treatment with alteplase is reasonable, level 2B of evidence. Other than that, there is also another condition.
Just 1 minute. What are the chances that when you give, suppose there is an LV thrombus, and that's both to Mackley and you, Nestle, and you give alteplase, what are the chances you can actually cause a thromboembolism to occur from there?
Yeah, this is a risk.
Experience on this issue. See,
no, this is.
Sorry.
Yeah, Mackley, continue.
Yeah. Okay. Now, getting a thrombus in the acute infarct intracavitary is statistically rare, unless and until it is a recurrent infarct. You know, patient had a previous infarct where he has developed aneurysm and he has got the thrombus, or previously atrial fibrillation otherwise. But de novo, because during the interventions or primary angioplasties, we always do the echocardiography before doing the intervention. So I am yet to see a thrombus what we are talking here in our real life scenario.
No, Mackley, I'm just referring to the fact that suppose the patient not come with the myocardial infarction, but has from a previous myocardial infarction an LV thrombus, and now he's come with a stroke and you need to give alteplase to the patient. What are the chances that that LV thrombus, if it is not organized, can cause thromboembolism after alteplase?
Yeah, but then see, there has to be some reason LV thrombus to form.
Yeah, it could be a previous MI the patient could have had sometime.
Yeah, if the patient, then there are certain,
or a recent MI. Yeah.
So there is a certain chance of getting a stroke because of the cardioembolic stroke in this situation. But I will not deter by doing the primary interventions in this type of patients or even thrombolysis.
Nothing, what's your take on that? Yeah.
This patient has got a recurrent MI. He has already, the moment he has got a thrombus, there's a lot of myocardium has already his acute function failure is going to be more high. So salvage is going to be important. Certain risk is, yes, it is there. Suppose if you don't do it, obviously his acute function is going to worsen further.
Nestle, what does it take? Will it cause the thrombus to get loose from there and cause?
Yeah, that theoretical risk is there definitely, and therefore if you see the recommendation, just Gayatri, just go up, show that recommendation. Yeah. So see, if the infarct is large and is likely to produce severe deficit, then you give IV alteplase. If it is minor, then you then the benefit is uncertain. So there is a theoretical risk of clot fragmentation. That is the risk. That if you give alteplase, there is a risk of clot fragmentation, but that risk is small, and that risk, the benefit of IV alteplase outweighs the risk of systemic embolization from clot fragmentation. So if the stroke is severe and disabling, you take that risk. It is a risk. It's not level 1 evidence. So it's level 1, 2A or 2B. So there is a small risk of clot fragmentation, but you take that risk and go ahead of course, you inform the family, and sometimes you get systemic embolization. You know, it goes into the brachial artery, or it goes into the leg or femoral artery, or wherever. So that is a risk you have to take. Yes.
Actually, in last so many years, we have actually come across only 1 or 2 patients where they have embolized, and fortunately,
it's a theoretical possibility.
They have gone into the legs rather than going to the brain. But it is a
you never know now where it will go. And you never know where it will go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So special conditions such as pregnancy, IV autoclave administration may be considered in pregnancy when the anticipated benefits of treating moderate or severe stroke outweigh the increased risk of uterine. Again, a level 2B. And safe. The safety.
See, this is the. Yeah, this is important because see, this IV alteplase is a big molecule, and it will not cross the placenta. So at the most, it can produce a little placental bleeding, but it doesn't go into the fetus, and it doesn't produce fetal hemorrhage. Now, there have been, you know, in the world literature, if you see, there have been about 40 cases or so, 40, 50 cases where it has been used. So, you know, safety studies have not been done, but it is a reasonable thing. If a young woman comes with a stroke and she's pregnant, I would definitely give, because the benefit will outweigh the risk.
Okay, I'll add another comment here, Leslie. That patients with you can't take them for the primary angioplasty because of the radiation hazard. So obviously, you are left with the choice of thrombolysis.
Yes. So radiation is a problem. But you know, if it is if it is third trimester, the mother's health outweighs the risk. So, you know, if the mother dies or gets disabled, so that is a big risk. So I think first you would look at the mother's health rather than the fetus. Of course, the fetus is important. Nobody denies that. But if it is in the third trimester, you can take for radiation. I mean, you can take for thrombolysis or mechanical thrombectomy also.
Personally, I prefer, because the radiation involved in the primary intervention maybe like more, because it depends on how many views you are, what views you are taking. So, you know, the scatter.
So it is a risk. It is a weighing the benefit versus the risk.
Okay, Gayatri, please go ahead.
So some contraindications. That is 0 to 3 hour window or a mild disabling stroke. IV autoclave is not recommended. Similarly, mild disabling stroke, as Sir mentioned, even if it comes within the window period, it is, I mean, it's a level 3 evidence. So the benefits, the risks are more than benefits. And as we mentioned yesterday, if the MRI modalities are not present, then a CT can also be used along with the clinical signs and symptoms. Also there is another important contraindication I would like to highlight, which is the low molecular weight heparin. So it should not be administered in patients who have received a full dose of low molecular weight heparin in the last 24 hours. That is a level 3 evidence. It does more risk than benefit. Also, the use of thromboxane A2 inhibitors are not recommended. Similarly, use of GP2B3A inhibitors like apixaban are not indicated in acute stroke, and similarly aspirin, which are actually used for MI. Moving on, again, this is just an overview of the autoclave use and the infusion rates and the BP and everything.
Okay, I just want to stop you for a minute over here. There is a question pertinent to this. What it says, Nasli, is in patients with LV thrombus, as they will already be on oral anticoagulation, should we thrombolize? That's a very important question.
Yeah. Now see, so we have to decide if the patient is on warfarin, you do the prothrombin time. I mean, or the INR. And if the INR is equal to or less than 1.7, you can thrombolize. If the patient is on NOAC and not taken the NOAC for 24 hours plus, then you can thrombolize. We discussed this yesterday.
Yes, yes.
So this is how one would go about it.
Okay. So coming to.
So we talked about tenecteplase, that level of evidence is 2B.
Yes, yes.
Dr. Wadia had asked this question, so we've discussed this.
So giving any other.
Let me ask you the question.
Yes.
Nasli.
Yes.
Tenecteplase, the originals like Metalize versus the generic. What is your experience?
You know, this problem is there.
I'll put it other way around. I'll put it
Yeah.
from the other perspective. In the myocardial infarction, I have found the generics, the patency rate is less and chances of the intracranial bleeding are more. I have had 3 bleeds intracranial. Cranial means I gave it for the myocardial infarction and landed with the 3 intracranial bleed. 3 patients landed with intracranial bleed.
Yeah. See, this Metalase, that means the originator molecule made by Boehringer, is not licensed for stroke thrombolysis.
No, I'm giving it for the myocardial infarction.
No. Now, myocardial, you are the expert here. I don't know. But the generic one, tenecteplase, is licensed only in India. There is no head-to-head study, or there is no study done in India. It is only a phase 4 study. They have not done phase 3 study. So that element of doubt little bit remains. But many people have used the generic tenecteplase in India, and they have found that it works pretty good. So this is this thing. I'm a little careful. I'm a little unsure about it, still, because they've not done a proper trial. And due to some reason, it is only approved in India. It is not approved in the rest of the world for stroke thrombolysis, though a lot of studies have been done in Australia by Bruce Campbell and Parson. A lot of studies in Australia. So they are using it in Australia, and they are using it in Norway. So few countries in the world are using it, but it is off-label use. In India, it is still on-label use, and that is the biosimilar tenecteplase. Metalase is not licensed for use in AIS in India.
Okay, go ahead.
Right. So the tenecteplase has not been proven to be superior or non-inferior to alteplase, but might be considered as an alternative to alteplase in patients with minor neurological impairment. This is also a level 2B evidence. Again, there is no role of IV defibrinogenating agents other than alteplase or tenecteplase. And use of sonothrombolysis as an adjuvant therapy is also not recommended. So coming to mechanical thrombectomy, patients eligible for IV alteplase should receive IV alteplase even if they are considered to have mechanical thrombectomy. It's a level 1A evidence. I would like to show one. Flow chart about the mechanical thrombectomy. I'm so sorry. Let's come back to this. Yeah. So these are the indications for mechanical thrombectomy in patients of acute ischemic stroke. So symptom onset or last known well, we'll have to find out to make it make sure that it's an acute ischemic stroke. Suppose it is less than 4.5 hours or 4.5 hours to 24 hours. Definitely, we have to give the patient the IV TPA, and if eligible, yes, we have to give the IV TPA. If it is beyond 24 hours, then we'll have to go forward with standard evaluation and care. We'll have to do a CT angio or an MR angio, obviously. So if the stroke is because of an anterior circulation large artery occlusion, if it is less than 6 hours, then mechanical thrombectomy is indicated. Also, if it is from 6 to 24 hours, it is indicated, but we'll come to that. So mechanical thrombectomy is indicated if treatment can be started within 6 hours of stroke symptom onset, and neuroimaging is showing, as Sir said, a small core, large penumbra, limited signs of early ischemia change as per the aspect score, which is of more than or equal to 6, and obviously no hemorrhage. And also the thrombus, the large vessel occlusion is causing a persistent, potentially disabling neurological deficit. So if the patient is coming beyond 6 to 24 hours and mechanical thrombectomy is indicated for these patients as well, as per the DAWN trial. This is with or without the thrombolysis the patient goes through if the patient comes within 4.5 hours. The patient cannot be thrombolized, can be thrombolized. Sir, actually, could you please explain about the software for automated imaging?
So that is an automated software which comes with the MRI or CT machine, and that shows you the core and the penumbra.
Sir, actually, we had gone for a lecture very recently, which was talking about the perfusion scan using the CT. Yeah. So is that
you can use that, but you know that is done manually. But now there are softwares available. The thing is, it's very expensive. You know, each patient it costs about 1 lakh rupees. So you know, we find it very difficult to handle. We don't have it in our machine, so we have to rely on eyeballing only. So what I told you was, now a little bit, I'll just talk to you a little bit about mechanical thrombectomy. You know, if the large vessels are involved, then IV TPA doesn't work so well. It cannot, because the clot load is high, it cannot dissolve the clot. So you have to do clot extraction. You have to remove the clot. Now, previous to 2015, we had very poor hardware to remove the clot. And now we have good hardware. These are called stent retrievers. That means they are stents, but you remove the stent after the stent gets embedded in the clot, and you extract the clot. So like a cardiac stent remains inside, or a carotid stent remains inside. Here the stent is removed. So these are called stent retrievers. So these are called these devices are called Solitaire or Trevo. So these are stent retrievers. So after this new technology has come, very quickly you can remove the clot from a large artery. Which are the large arteries? Internal carotid artery and first part of the MCA. The maximum trials are done from them, but you can also remove the clot from the basilar artery and the vertebral artery. So, these trials are not so good yet, but level 1 evidence is for internal carotid artery and the M1. And if you remove this clot, many of these patients improve dramatically. In fact, they improve on the table. So if you can do this within 6 hours, if you do the groin puncture within 6 hours, and very quickly after 1 or 2 passes, you can remove the clot with these stent retrievers. Another device is what we call the penumbra device. It is an aspiration device. So you aspirate the clot out. So you can use a combination of these things. The only problem is that these are still very expensive, and the hardware itself costs 4 to 5 lakh rupees. And because of the court order, we cannot reuse the equipment. So that's why this the cost factor comes in, and we cannot do too many cases. But it has been found to be very useful.
Femoral approach?
Yes. So you do a groin puncture and go up, and you cross the clot. You embed the stent within the clot, and then you remove it. And the clot gets embedded in the stent, and the blood flow is maintained. I mean, blood flow is restored. Now, so this is done within the first 6 hours. But if we find So as I told you, this Dawn trial came, and there's a fewer number of patients. If there is a small core and a large penumbra, you can do it up to 24 hours. So you don't give these patients IV TPA, you go straight for mechanical thrombectomy and you remove the clot, and number needed to treat is only 2 to 3. It's fantastic. It works like magic, you know, sometimes. So, but we have to develop that expertise. It is expensive. The imaging has to be good. Many things have to fall into place before we can do it.
So these are two individual treatments. These are quick question. These are two individual treatments, or you can combine them? Can you give these before the thrombectomy?
No. This is part of the thrombectomy.
No. Your thrombolysis and thrombectomy.
So if it is within first 6 hours, you give IV TPA followed by thrombolysis. If it is after 6 hours, you go for direct mechanical thrombectomy. Yeah, Gayatri, understood?
Yes.
Add. Is there any neuroendocrinologist today in our group?
Say that again.
Hello.
Yeah.
Is there any neurointerventionist today in our group? Okay.
Sanjay, I don't think so.
No, there isn't anybody.
Okay, Gayatri, go ahead.
So the general criteria for a mechanical thrombectomy.
Yeah, I think this is too complicated. We don't need to go so much into this.
Yes, sir.
Fine. Dr. Wadia.
Yeah. Go over this fast now.
There is one
I think sir
there is one
sir
other
wants to.
point to be noted, that if you have a clot in only one territory, then one cerebral hemisphere, then the chances are that the lesion is in the internal carotid on that side, or the MCA on that side. If you have it on two sides, then the chances are actually that it is an embolic stroke.
Yes.
If you have it on three sides, that means two sides and the posterior fossa, there is a good chance that it is a malignancy.
Yes. So three vessel I mentioned that three vessel involvement is almost always malignancy.
Almost always more common malignancy.
If you get in 3 vessels, it is almost always malignancy.
And 2 vessels, and it is more likely embolus.
Cardioembolic. Cardioembolic.
So you should be looking from the heart.
Yes.
How it happened.
You must look at the heart every single time. This Dr. Wadia has told me 30 years ago. For neurology, you have to look in the heart. Whether you get syncope or whether you get a stroke or whether, so you have to look at the heart, and it is extremely important.
Not multiple sclerosis, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah, but many of our day-to-day things now, this though you had told us 30, 40 years ago. I don't know when, but it holds absolutely true. It holds absolutely true.
Mechanical thrombectomy. So as Sir said, patients should receive mechanical thrombectomy with stent retriever if they meet the criteria, which is pre-stroke modified score of 0 to 1.
Yeah, this is very complicated, Gayatri. I don't think you need all this, you know. It's difficult for us also to understand. So just know that, you know, within 6 hours you should aim for this, and then leave it to the specialist. Yes.
There is a question: the anterior versus posterior stroke, mechanical thrombectomy. What is your opinion?
Yeah, so anterior circulation, the trials have been done. You know, there are many trials. There are 5 or 6 trials which are done in 2015. The most important trial being MR Clean, which was done in the Netherlands. And that was the first really trial which showed that there is tremendous benefit. So this was done for the internal carotid artery thrombus and M1 thrombus. Now for the posterior fossa, there is no trial which has been done, or the recruitment has been extremely difficult. And there is an equipoise between IV thrombolysis and mechanical thrombectomy. But I think I would favor mechanical thrombectomy with a large vessel occlusion, and you can do it even later. In many patients, it's done 6 to 8 hours later, and also with very good results. So if you have a mid-basilar thrombosis, these patients will die. The mortality is 90% of mid-basilar thrombosis. So if you can give IV thrombolysis and dislodge the clot or do mechanical, it is a great advantage. So you may bring down the mortality to say 50% or so. It can't come to zero, impossible. So, from 90% it can come down to 50%. So certainly one would try it, but there is no robust trial to back this statement. There is no robust trial. So we do it. Many things are done off-label. But because to mount trials and to do things is not an easy job, so we don't have level 1 evidence for that. Maybe the level of evidence is 2B or so, maybe in that range.
I think Gayatri is on 46 of 71 slides.
Baapre, come on, go fast, man.
To go.
Yes, sir.
Don't go into all these minor details. Those are meant for specialists.
Okay, sir. So as we mentioned, the blood pressure management.
Blood pressure we have talked about.
Okay. So the other endovascular therapies. Obviously mechanical thrombectomy is with stent retrieval is recommended. That is a class 1A evidence.
No, this chap was asking, no?
Yes.
Kamerkar was asking yesterday, can we do intra-arterial thrombolysis? So here it is. Here is the answer.
Intra-arterial fibrinolysis initiated within 6 hours of stroke. Onset is carefully selected patients who have contraindications for use on IV autoclaves could be considered. It's a level 2B evidence.
Yeah, so
they can be considered.
So it's a little. Okay.
Yes. Coming to the antiplatelet treatment. So administration of aspirin is recommended in the patients with stroke within 24 to 48 hours after onset. For those treated with IV autoclaves, it should be delayed for 24 hours and may be considered in the presence of any other concomitant conditions. So that is a level 1 of evidence.
No, Sanjay asked this question. Suppose there's myocardial infarction and you put a stent in. So can you give aspirin? So here is the answer. You can give. There is no proper trial to say that you have to wait for 24 hours. But generally, one would wait for 24 hours. Generally, one would wait.
Then, moving on to antiplatelet treatment. So, patients who do not receive IV autoclaves and with a minor non-cardioembolic ischemic stroke, treatment with dual antiplatelet, that is aspirin and clopidogrel, is started within 24 hours of symptom onset and should be continued up to at least 21 days. And it is seen to be effective in reducing the recurrence of the ischemic stroke for up to a period of 90 days. This is also level 1A of evidence.
Okay. Gayatri, can you hold on?
Yes.
Leslie.
Okay.
Makle, you want to say something?
Yeah.
No.
I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Here we are talking about antiplatelet agent, that is aspirin and clopidogrel. Now, in the dual antiplatelet,
Clay, you are not clear.
Come into the neuro interventions or not yet? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Not clear. Not clear.
Makle, you have to come close to the mic and speak. If you go away, you can't be heard. You have to come close to the mic and speak.
Okay. I wanted to ask whether the newer antiplatelet agents, that is a clopidogrel and ticagrelol, whether they have come into the neurointerventions or not yet.
Clopidogrel definitely is there. Ticagrelor and that is Brilinta, we are very scared, because of the risk of intracerebral hemorrhage. So in general, we don't use. Some intervention is, to dissolve the clot, use tirofiban, but it's off-label. It's off-label. It's not the recommendation at present. So, but definitely Brilinta we don't use. Makle, we don't like Brilinta and we get very, very scared of that Brilinta. Yeah, here it is.
Yes.
Ticagrelor is not recommended over aspirin for treatment of minor stroke.
Yes, sir. So the efficacy of IV G2B3A inhibitors like tirofiban, the level of evidence is 2B. It is not well established in an acute ischemic stroke. Similarly, as Sir said, ticagrelor is also not recommended over aspirin or even as a replacement for aspirin in the patients with stroke. There is a level 3 of evidence. There is no benefit. Similarly, the administration of IV G2B3A inhibitor, which is axizumab, as a medical treatment of acute ischemic stroke is harmful and should not be performed. So the only coming further to the anticoagulants. So the usefulness of urgent anticoagulation in patients of severe stenosis of internal carotid artery ipsilateral to an ischemic stroke is not well established. That is also level 2B evidence. And safety and usefulness of short-term anticoagulation for non-occlusive extracranial intraluminal thrombus in the setting of an acute ischemic stroke is not established. That is also level 2B evidence. Also, the use of the newer oral anticoagulants like dabigatran, the use of these are not well established. That is also level of 2B. Sir, but could you highlight about the use of this newer oral anticoagulants in the non-valvular atrial fibrillation and new onset stroke patients?
So I think that's a separate lecture, no?
Okay.
We can keep that as, it's a huge topic. It's a huge topic. So, but definitely we would prefer NOACs over warfarin for non-valvular AF. A short answer.
Okay, sir.
I agree. It's a separate presentation by itself.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
But patients who have got a non-valvular AF.
Yes.
That's all.
If it is a valvular AF, if it is mild MS, maybe you can use it. But for severe MS and mechanical valves, definitely not.
All those criteria, which valve and which valvular lesion and all those things, that we can discuss it at that time.
Yeah.
So use of
Gayatri, you go over all this. This is not very important,
Sir, should I go over this?
But that's enough now. What time is it?
8:30.
Yeah, 8:36. Deep vein thromboprophylaxis.
Yes, sir. So using intermittent pneumatic compression is indicated. That is a level 1B evidence. Also using brain swelling, sir, with patients of large territorial cerebellar or cerebral infarcts with a high risk of developing edema, cerebral edema or herniation. We have to obviously inform the relatives, and I think a decompression is better than anything else in these patients, which is a level 1F evidence. Also, they have to be closely monitored. So similarly, like I mentioned, the decompressive optimal trigger for decompressive craniotomy is not known, but it is reasonable to use a decrease in level of consciousness as the criteria for increasing cerebral pressures, that is the edema. So we can move on from this.
So this is important. Maybe we can just talk for 2 minutes on this. Decompressive craniectomy is a very, very important thing to do, especially if there's a large MCA infarct and it is producing pressure on the brain and it's producing coning. Radiological coning occurs producing coning, and by doing decompression craniectomy, we can reduce the mortality from 80% to 28%. So it's a very, very useful thing to do, especially in people who are less than 60. But it's not a contraindication to do it after the age of 60. The level of evidence becomes 2B after 60. Right. But below 60, the level of evidence is 2A. So if the person is getting swelling of the brain and midline shift, don't wait for the pupil to dilate. Just a little bit, the sensorium goes down, and there is a midline shift of more than 5 to 6 millimeter on the CT scan or MRI. You trigger it and call the neurosurgeon and tell him very quickly that you have to do decompressive craniectomy with duroplasty. You have to open up the dura also, and this saves life. And many such patients are doing reasonably. I wouldn't say they are normal, but it saves life, and some of them are mobile also.
Also, for cerebellar
infarct, it is the same thing. You decompress very quickly.
Yes, a decompressive suboccipital craniectomy with neural expansion.
Neural expansion. Yeah.
Even if it is a cerebral or cerebellar
yes.
malignant infarct.
Yeah.
Level 1B evidence.
Yeah, go fast.
So for seizures, so recent recurrent seizures after stroke should be treated similarly as we would usually treat a seizure, which is with anti-seizure medications. Prophylactic use is not recommended.
Yeah, so don't give Levipil to every Tom, Dick and Harry.
As Sir mentioned yesterday, vascular imaging is very, very important, especially if it is for patients of non-disabling, that is modified Rankin score of 0 to 2, acute ischemic stroke of carotid territory, who are candidates for stenting or non-invasive imaging of the cervical carotid artery should be performed within 24 hours. This Sir had mentioned yesterday.
Yep.
So basically, imaging is important, as Sir mentioned, right from the arch up to the cerebral arteries and veins. Coming to cardiac evaluation, like Sir had mentioned yesterday, so an ECG is definitely important to find out if there is a basic atrial fibrillation, that is a level 1B. As Sir mentioned yesterday, that we need to do a continuous cardiac monitoring to assess an atrial fibrillation after a cryptogenic stroke. As Sir said, the etiology of the stroke is not found. So, like Sir mentioned yesterday, we need to do the weeks of Holter monitoring could also be recommended to find out if there was even a minor atrial fibrillation, which could have caused the stroke. So, this is a level 2B evidence, which is quite good. Also, coming to antithrombotic treatment for non-cardioembolic strokes. So using antiplatelet agents rather than oral anticoagulation is recommended to reduce the risk of recurrent strokes. This is a level 1A evidence. So I'll just go ahead. I think this is repetitive.
Yeah.
Okay, Nasli, just one quick question.
Yes.
What should the dose of aspirin be and statin be to start in ischemic strokes?
Yeah. So dose of aspirin. Now see, it's a little different for chronic use and for acute use. If there is a minor stroke or TIA, you would start with, say, 300 milligram of aspirin and 4 tablets of clopidogrel. 4 is how much? 150. 300 milligrams of clopidogrel stat, followed by 150 milligrams of aspirin. And long-term use can be from 75 to 150. There is no benefit of high-dose aspirin over low-dose aspirin. In fact, the risk of GI bleeding is higher with high-dose aspirin. The benefit is equal from 50 to 300. It's equal of aspirin. So use low-dose aspirin, 75 milligram or 81 milligram, that Bayer aspirin which is there. That is quite adequate for long-term use. And clopidogrel, initial loading dose followed by 75 milligram daily for 21 days. Don't give double antiplatelets for too long, maybe 2-3 months max, and then give single antiplatelet agent. Even if there is a stent, 2 to 3 months of double antiplatelets are enough. and then you use single antiplatelet agent. Clopidogrel slightly better, just by 1 or 2 percentage points over aspirin, but the cost is more. Regarding statins, you start with 80 milligrams of atorvastatin, stat, and give it for a few months, and then do a targeted LDL and bring the LDL down to, say, if it is for secondary prevention, bring the LDL down to 70. And so you do a targeted thing, but start with 80 milligrams of atorvastatin or 40 milligrams of rosuvastatin.
Thank you.
So similarly, in patients of acute ischemic stroke with AFib, it is reasonable to initiate oral anticoagulants between 4 to 14 days after the onset of neurological symptoms. This is a level 2A evidence. For patients with a history of ischemic stroke, AFib, and coronary artery disease, the usefulness of adding antiplatelets to oral anticoagulants is uncertain for the purpose of reducing the risk of another stroke or a cerebrovascular event. Unstable angina and coronary artery stenting represent special circumstances which may be managed with dual antiplatelets or oral anticoagulation. This is also level 2. So yeah, this is important. Hemorrhagic transformation. For patients of acute ischemic stroke and hemorrhagic transformation, initiation and continuation of antiplatelets or anticoagulation should be considered depending on the specific clinical scenario of the patient and underlying indication. So after managing the initial hemorrhagic transformation, we should restart the at least single antiplatelet for these patients. Lastly, carotid revascularization. When revascularization is indicated for secondary prevention in patients of minor or non-disabling stroke, which is a modified Rankin score of 0 to 2, it is reasonable to perform the procedure within 4 to 7 days of the index event rather than delayed, because revascularization, as Sir said, gives good results. That is a level 2A of evidence. I think this.
Yeah, fine.
Nasli, just a question to you. What would be the level of stenosis that you would look for a revascularization to do? Because, depending on whether it should be more than 50%, more than 70%.
More than 50%. Or maybe, in our setting, we take it at more than 70%. More than 70%, you have to learn how to calculate it properly because, various people use various things. But more than 70%, I think I would do revascularization. And either, Dhanesh Kamerkar is a super expert in carotid endarterectomy. And we've done a number of cases together and superb results. Absolutely superb results. And other thing is stenting. Stenting is also good. It has its little problems here and there, but it's easy to do, and the patient can go home in 2 or 3 days. But in eligible patients, I would prefer endarterectomy over stenting because it is done so well. And we have facilities for doing both. Many people don't have facilities, they don't have such a good vascular surgeon, but we are lucky to have such an expert. And
Nasli,
yeah.
Would the plaque
Nasli to finish?
Nasli, would the plaque characteristics dictate when you want to do it? Suppose you've got a hard fibrous plaque versus a soft lipid-rich plaque, would a 50% also you would tend to stent, or would you still prefer a 70%? Because a plaque rupture can happen with 50% lipid-rich and soft.
Actually, the recommendation is 50%. If you see the Western literature,
plaque characteristics also determine that.
This plaque morphology by these good quality MRIs, you can do plaque morphology. You can find the fibrous cap. You can find whether the fibrous cap is ruptured or not, whether there is platelet accumulation or not, whether there is intraplaque hemorrhage or not. So whether there's a plaque ulcer or not. So these plaque morphology, but this is not yet come in the recommendations. If we find a dirty looking plaque, really dirty looking plaque, ulcerated, fibrous, hemorrhagic, and the stenosis is less than 50%, even then we would do it. even then we would do it, but that's not the general recommendation. General recommendation is more than 50% occlusion. But if the morphology is bad...
I'm ready to finish, then I'm going to rebut.
Huh?
Okay, Makle, go ahead. Makle wants to differ from you.
No, let Leslie finish.
Yeah. So no, this is my view. So if it's a dirty looking plaque, maybe we would do it early rather than later. Yes, Makle?
Yeah. Now let us start with the carotid intervention. See now, Ganesh and me, we are very thick friends. But you have to go by both the European criteria as well as the North American criteria for the evaluation of the stenosis. Point number 2, all game is totally different if it is a patient who had a symptomatic, who had a history of TI in the past. You have to be very aggressive. Both medically.
It has to be symptomatic. Arey Baba, wait. I didn't make that point. It has to be symptomatic carotid stenosis. If it is asymptomatic, so, don't do.
Recurrent TIs.
Yes.
Then obviously you do CT, MRI, you do the all non-invasive tests, including the carotid intimal thickness, carotid, carotid Dopplers, etc. And after that, when you are doing the angiograph, if you find there is a thrombus, then please wait. Don't rush for the intervention at that time. But if you find it is a significant, even if it is 50% which is by the eyeballing, of course, we have got a facility for where we can do the 3D rotational angiography and we can get much better ideas and we can do the intervention. And we have done a good number of interventions and with a good result. So basically, even worldwide also, the carotid interventions vis-a-vis carotid endarterectomy, they have come on equal platform. It is definitely non-inferiority. I can give the number of the trials. And there are certain situations where surgeons can't do anything because what they call it as a hostile neck or hostile carotid, there we do the intervention. So carotid is very much there. It depends on the expertise of the center and expertise of the people who are doing there. Yep. Next is why we don't do it in thrombus, because these are all self-expanding stents. So actually when you are deploying the stent, the thrombus tries to come back into the circulation. Although we are using the distal protection device during the procedure, but afterwards patient can still get some TIs. And all these trials, whatever they have done, they have gone not only the stroke on the table, but also the cognitive functions, etc., a number of whatever those different scales, Minnesota scales, and etc. So carotid stenting is very much there. Yes, we have to find the selected patients. Am I done or hello?
No, Makle, still the question becomes unanswered. That are you going to? What are the criteria? Are you going to do it 50%, 70%? Is the plaque characteristics going to dictate it? Okay. Or understood, no. Thrombus is not a threat. You know, thrombus, we all agree that there could be an embolization that could happen. If you have a fibrous cap at a 70%, would you do it? And if you have you still do the fibrous plaque at a 70%?
No, don't. See, if there is significant stenosis, significant means more than 50%, and it is a symptomatic carotid, do it within the first symptomatic in the first 6 months. After 6 months, it becomes asymptomatic. So if he has had a minor stroke or a TIA within 6 months and you find that it is more than 50%, then there is benefit in revascularization versus medical therapy. Now, which revascularization?
Carotid endarterectomy and carotid stenosis. 2 minutes patron log together.
Okay, so this, yeah.
I think Danish is logging in. Danish is logging in a minute, so you can also tell us.
Danish log in because he's a dada in this, yeah.
Same link.
Yeah.
Quickly log in. We're waiting for you. So Danish is logging in. I think he'll be able to clarify this better.
Symptomatic or asymptomatic? If it is asymptomatic, less than
asymptomatic, don't do.
I will leave it.
Don't do.
Yeah.
Because the benefit that you give is just 1%. and there is 1 to 2% risk of distal embolization.
Totally driven by the symptom.
Driven by?
Symptoms.
Yeah. So if it is symptomatic, do it.
Yeah.
If it's asymptomatic, don't do it.
Irrespective of the level of stenosis.
Is Dr.
50%. 50% and above.
Oh, he's just logging in a minute. He's already logged in.
I just joined.
Yeah, you take the next point if there is any, or we're finished.
No, sir, it's done. It's done.
It's done.
Yeah,
Okay, let Danish come in.
Okay, Danish is online. Come on, Danish.
Yeah.
We want a little information about carotid stenosis. When are you going to stent, and when are you going to do an endarterectomy? And the question is, which are the cases that you're going to do stenting for a carotid stenosis?
I think there are very clear-cut guidelines internationally. Basically, let's look at it, the whole science. Both are basically complementary to each other. But there are specific indications for endarterectomy and very specific indications for stenting. Now, if you look at the endarterectomy, we are looking at somebody 60% stenosis symptomatic onwards and who is medically fit to undergo surgery. Now, we also need to look at if there's no high bifurcation and there is no previous radiation therapy to the neck. At the same time, we also need to look at, in case one wants to look at stenting, there is tortuosity of the iliacs and tortuosity of carotids and arch vessels and the calcified vessels are strictly no for a stenting. There are very specific indications for stenting. If somebody is unfit for open surgery, somebody who's had a very high bifurcation or radiation of neck, then they should go for angioplasty and stenting. So these are the very clear-cut guidelines universally. Now, when we look at the patient from our perspective, every individual clinician have to decide on going on these guidelines, what is better for that patient, whether it's endarterectomy or angioplasty stenting. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen here for various reasons, but these are the very clear-cut guidelines.
Ganesh?
Yeah.
Question under consideration was a symptomatic patient with severity of the stenosis. At what point you will do it? So obviously you are going to use the Nassett criteria as well as ICAS criteria.
Okay.
And so what level of stenosis will you do the carotid stenting?
No, if I am treating an asymptomatic carotid stenosis, I look at few things. One is whether MRI brain is showing silent infarcts corresponding to that territory, carotid territory, number one. Number two, if the carotid Doppler is showing ulcerated plaques on that side, which would go in favor of intervention than otherwise. And number three, if it is a bilateral tight stenosis. So all these things would basically dictate my decision as to whether I should intervene or otherwise. A lot of asymptomatic carotid stenosis, which is unilateral, 60, 70%, 80% asymptomatic, can be left alone and observed.
So if you have a fibrous plaque, the question is, will you do a stenting even at 70%? And you have the brain which shows no previous infarct.
If it is, sorry, if it is?
If you have a fibrous plaque at 70% and no previous infarct or asymptomatic.
No, I wouldn't do anything. I would observe it.
No, you'll give medical treatment.
Best medical treatment.
Yes.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Nasli.
Yeah.
Is there a
so what guidelines were these presented?
These are very gray areas in this carotid stenosis, asymptomatic, symptomatic, whether to go for surgery or whether to go for stenting. And everybody basically from different specialty, because they're common terms, likes to sway as per their liking. This is what I would say.
Hey, don't smoke.
Smoking is
Which
injurious for
guidelines
health.
did you? Gayatri?
Parimal, you want to ask something?
Dr. Gayatri, which guidelines were you presenting?
No, these are
Which
basically
guidelines
for
were present?
asymptomatic and symptomatic as well.
No. I'm
These
asking
are the
Gayatri
AHA,
because
American Heart Association.
Yes, sir. Yes. American Heart Association updated guidelines for management of acute ischemic stroke. So
which
the
year?
older guidelines were all reviewed, and in
2019.
2019, these new guidelines have come. Very few changes have been.
Shall I tell you also the new concepts in carotid intervention? When somebody has had a small stroke or a TIA, the best optimal intervention period is from 3rd day to 14th day, and where you get a maximum benefit of prevention of major stroke in the long term. If you start going beyond 14 days, you start losing the benefits of carotid interventions.
I think we've had a great discussion. Anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask before we close the session just now. Anybody has any questions, please feel free to write or to ask, and then we'll close the session and start tomorrow.
I would suggest Sanjay that if you have the topics by afternoon, then you know the
it is already there, Danish. Danish is there. Danish.
Sanjay, tell us tomorrow's topic.
Tomorrow is, I think, thrombolysis in MI.
Okay.
And what?
Same.
We are doing thrombo.
7:30.
No, can we have it 8 o'clock? Because I have got some other meetings going on till 8 o'clock.
Sir, actually, we'll just review the topics because now 2 topics have been added. So we'll just review the topic, and we'll just within an hour we'll put up the new timetable for the lecture.
Can I request between 8 to 9, because Delhi I have got some other meeting which goes up to 8 o'clock.
So tomorrow we won't keep MIs.
Change the topic. I think don't change the time.
Most probably sepsis will be.
Sepsis you can do tomorrow.
Most probably. Yes.
And Makhare, do you want to combine PAMI and thrombolysis, because we have had so much discussion on thrombolysis? Maybe we can combine the two together. What do you feel?
We can do DVT and PE tomorrow. Why don't we do DVT and PE tomorrow?
No. If Makhare is not there, we'll do sepsis.
Okay. All right.
So,
Sanjay,
okay.
Sanjay, can I also suggest some topics which are beneficial to everybody?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'll basically put it on the group tomorrow.
Yeah, you
put it on the group. Put it on the group.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you.
Before we finish,
Okay,
Danesh, you came in late. Danesh.
Yeah.
But I complimented you in the most glowing terms for your efficiency in doing carotid endarterectomy.
Thank you so much.
No, but we've had great successes, man.
Thank you.
I witnessed that, yeah. And
Yeah.
so, firstly, I seconded that.
Yeah.
I want to thank Dr. Nasli for this wonderful interaction that he's given on stroke. He'll of course be with us in all the other future meetings also for your input always.
Yeah.
But I wanted to really say thank you for all your input.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Gayatri, you have done very well. And especially today, you showed all these guidelines, and I think we've discussed many things threadbare. So I hope you follow it, and I hope it benefits you in your future life.
And we hope you keep logging in every day at 7:30 for your continued interaction.
That I will do.
So one last question. Actually, somebody on the group has asked if there is any BP target to maintain for the carotid endarterectomy.
Ganesh?
Or carotid stenosis patients.
Yeah, for post endarterectomy, we basically keep the BPs around 120, 130 systolic.
Yeah.
Now there are a couple of issues in this. Is that if the BP really shoots up post surgery period, there is a risk of bleeding intracranially. More so if it's a very tight carotid stenosis, and suddenly you're opening the gates. You know, you're flooding the brain with things. So one has to be really careful. So and this is where there is a importance of a good anesthetist to control the blood pressure in a perioperative period. Because if the BP shoots up, there's a risk of intracranial bleeding.
It is called reperfusion hemorrhage.
Yes.
It is. And another thing, you know, when you fiddle around with the carotid carotid sinus, you can get hypotension transiently. Especially if you do stenting, you get hypotension and you have to give dopamine or noradrenaline and get the BP up, because otherwise the cerebral perfusion will suffer. So you have to keep the BP within normal limits around 130, 140. And as Dr. Kamerkar said, if it goes high, there is a high risk of reperfusion injury, and then suddenly patients become very bad. So keep the BP low.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, same thing holds true when you are doing the carotid intervention.
You are not clear, yaar. Your voice is breaking.
Okay.
You come close, please.
Is it clear now?
Not so
you
good.
were somewhere close to the window, and you were great at that time when you were close to the window somewhere. Yeah.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Better.
Yeah. So the same thing holds true when we are doing the carotid interventions. We have to maintain the mean arterial pressure around 100. Means rather than we look at it as systolic pressure, we can maintain this mean arterial pressure around 100, 90 to 100. We do tell the anesthesiologist to have the two separate lines, both inotropes as well as dilators and fluids. The other thing, what you must keep it in mind, between the right carotid and left carotid stenting, right carotid stenting usually, or most of the time, will after the post stent deployment, after the post dilatation, they will land with the bradycardia. So you should have the temporary pacemaker in the situ. Vis-a-vis the left carotid, whatever I have found, most of the time they land into the hypotension, and post procedure they can remain in hypotension for 2 to 3 days till the time the baroreceptors are resettled on all those things. So these are doing the carotid intervention, you need to have the proper hemodynamic assessment and hemodynamic management while you are doing it. This question comes particularly with the patient who is previously hypertensive. So actually we stop the antihypertensive that day in the morning, and we control their pressures with IV nitroglycerin or nitroprusside during the procedure. So this is what is the protocols we have to follow.
So when we are doing the surgery, we have a bigger advantage that we inject local anesthetic in the carotid body before we clamp the artery and before we start endarterectomy. So all these perioperative fluctuations of BP are much less as compared to doing an intervention where we have no control. So by injecting local anesthetic in the carotid body just before clamping and endarterectomy makes a lot of difference.
Will that work while we are doing the carotid intervention?
It does. No. So carotid intervention, you can't do it.
It's a good point. It's a good point.
That is why when we are doing carotid stenting, many of times the people basically put in a temporary pacemaker in case there is sudden severe brady.
Yeah.
Which can be controlled better when you're doing surgery, because once you inject local anesthetic in the carotid body, it makes a further surgery very smooth.
So why not inject before carotid stenting also? Just inject a little local anesthetic in the bifurcation.
It has to be done ultrasound guided. Maybe you'll have to call interventionist.
Danesh, just for my information, how does the local anesthetic work? What is the mechanism of action?
It desensitizes your carotid body. So all your fluctuations of carotid body because of handling of the bifurcation goes away.
Okay.
Chalo, Sanjay, let's wind up.
Let's wind up. Thank you very much, everybody. And